Hey, Chris. Good to run
Hey,
into you. It's
Deborah.
been a while.
Yeah, it has been. But it's good to catch up because, needless to say, much has happened in the world in a short period of time.
Yes. Yeah, so much has been going on. And it's like hard to choose which thing to focus on. In fact, some of the podcasts I listen to, they're like, we're going to do something completely different because we need like perspective, you know? So, I mean, I've been preparing, I had been preparing for our next episode for this one by listening to another podcast, which I had done for the last episode. And this other one was specifically looking at like how to respond to fascism. And so I was preparing that. But then some breaking news came through from the UK, and as you know, I spent 17 years there and I'm still very much in that context more than the US context. I've been here in Colombia for 5 years, but before that, it was 17 years in the UK. So the news though feels really relevant and urgent and personal, and so I wanted to share this with you. There's a direct action protest group called Palestine Action, and they were founded in the UK in 2020. And now there's an offshoot like Palestine Action US. And these groups do direct action against the arms industry, which is supplying and enabling genocide. Now, the UK group, their press release from the 20th of June, 5 days ago from when we're recording, states, and I'll paraphrase a little bit here, Palestine Action have damaged two military planes in the UK, which leave daily for a base in Cyprus that are used for military operations in Gaza and across the Middle East. Two activists broke into the largest Air Force base in Britain and used electric scooters to swiftly maneuver towards the planes. They used repurposed fire extinguishers to spray red paint into the turbine engines of two Airbus Voyagers and caused further damage using crowbars. Red paint, symbolizing Palestinian bloodshed, was also sprayed across the runway, and a Palestine flag was left on the scene. Both activists managed to evade security and arrest. By putting the planes out of service, activists have interrupted Britain's direct participation in the commission of genocide and war crimes across the Middle East. And of course, in the show notes, I'll put links to all of this. So, as you know, and some other people listening might know, I used to be involved in Extinction Rebellion in the UK and internationally. And through that, I met some of the people who were in Palestine Action and still are. The world knows that what is happening to Palestinians is a genocide. People with particular access to resources do not want it to be called genocide, and so they are not using that term. And by not using that term, they are acting as if we don't say it, if we don't admit it, then it can't actually be happening. And that sort of reminds me of the US government response to COVID when they said, if we stop counting COVID cases, then there will no longer be a pandemic. So just because they don't want to call it a genocide doesn't mean that it isn't a genocide. And there's a long history of peaceful direct action where people like Catholic workers go into military installations and vandalize as a protest against violence against people around the world. Now, if we think about what we mean by terrorism, and maybe you can see where I'm going with this, according to the UK government, terrorism as defined in this particular act that I'm quoting from, means the use or threat of action which involves serious violence against a person, involves serious damage to property, endangers a person's life other than that of the person committing the act, creates a serious risk to the health or safety of the public or section of the public, or is designed seriously to interfere with or seriously to disrupt an electronic system. Now, I was living in New York City when 9/11 happened. I was living in St. George on Staten Island. I could just barely see the Twin Towers from a window in my apartment in the winter. But on this day in September, the leaves were still on the tree, and so I couldn't see them. At around 8:30 a.m., my grandfather called me from Arizona, waking me up, his voice shaking. He clearly was checking to see that I was not in Manhattan that day. He said to turn on the news, and then he couldn't say anything else. He was a World War II vet, and he was very shaken up. So I put on the television and I saw what was happening. Then I left my apartment and walked around the corner of the building to look at the full view of the Twin Towers, which were still standing but had smoke coming out of them. I would go back into my apartment, see what was happening on TV, and I was crying and weeping and talking on the phone to my husband. And I would go back out and see that a tower had actually fallen, and then go back in and see the other one fall on TV, and go outside to see that it was really happening, crying and crying. So, in the days after, the National Guard came in. There were all kinds of bomb scares on the subways. A plane fell out of the sky. We thought it was related. There was anthrax. We felt terrified. I remember thinking that we were now going to be living like people in Israel live. I remember thinking that because I remember the news showing terrorist attacks in Israel, and I didn't understand the context. But that's terrifying for them. It was terrifying for us. Every time I went into Manhattan, I was afraid something was going to happen. I felt terrorized. No matter who the group is, if you live in a place where there's a group of people or a state who are indiscriminately attacking civilians, that is what terrorism is to me. On the other hand, if there's a group that goes into private companies or government military installations to protest against violence against people in other parts of the world, and peacefully, non-violently may even destroy the machines that are responsible for the deaths of civilian people. And I'm not going to get into a conversation about violence and nonviolence right now. Any of that. I just want to speak specifically about these circumstances. I do not think that the British public feels terrorized by a group that is going into spaces like that to vandalize those spaces. It's not terrorism. It just isn't. And you can probably guess where I'm going with this. Palestine Action is set next week to become a proscribed group. That means it will be considered a terrorist group, and it will be against the law to be a member. You can go to prison for being a member. You can go to prison for supporting morally, verbally, financially the group. That's right. Morally supporting them, verbally supporting them. So going on social media to say that you approve of what this group is doing will be considered a criminal offense punishable by jail time, years in prison. Now, I have been very vocal on social media under my own name showing support for this group, as have thousands of other people in the UK, in the US, around the world. Now, going back to Extinction Rebellion, which was about climate change, their theory of change was the mass arrest strategy. They thought that if enough people blocked roads and got arrested, it would fill the jails and it would force the government to take action against climate change. Now, it's a whole other story to talk about how this failed and why. But we are about to have thousands of people who have openly supported Palestine Action. Are they all going to be arrested? What would happen if people saturated social media in Britain and the streets with pro-Palestine action sentiment that could overwhelm the police, the courts, prisons. It wouldn't be viable, and it would be unjust. It makes no sense for them to be described as a terrorist group. And there have been protests now since this has happened, like additional protests, but now protests that are just like pro Palestine action rather than just pro Palestine. These are people coming on the streets in protest to what the government is about to do to this group. Um, and in fact, someone in my affinity group mentioned the other day that this normally would be an occasion when the defense minister in Britain would resign out of shame because it shows what lack security the military base has, you know? And of course, you and I would want the whole government to resign for being complicit in genocide. And so this is why I wanted to bring this very new topic up on the podcast because, you know, I do have someone that I was an activist with who is in jail right now because of what he's done in Palestine Action. I know lots of other people, but even more than that is just the sheer number of people that support this organization. And now they want to make that a criminal offense, like punishable by prison. That's where my head's at right now.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that, Heather. Something that in simultaneous ways is very much about the moment while also being very much about decades of history, of systems, of structures. And the first thing that comes to my mind is this idea of pretext. I think it will be a worthy endeavor at some point in the future, if we wish to get into it, to discuss theories of change and in general discuss the processes that we undertake or perhaps should consider undertaking to look at theories of change and to review them and to critique them and to see how they have worked and not worked in the past. And also, what is changing about the present moment that may make old theories of change that maybe didn't work more relevant to today, as well as perhaps current theories of change that may have worked in the past no longer relevant to today. So I think that would be a very good conversation to have maybe in the future. Now, you are well aware that I often think in terms of systems and elements of systems. It's engineer mind, perhaps, yes, but of course, it's not just engineers who talk about systems. In fact, I credit many people who came from outside the world of science and engineering who taught me about social systems, and particularly how social systems express power. So when I think of Palestine Action being prescribed now under, my understanding is correct, under the UK's Terrorism Act 2000, I think of this umbrella framing, a framing I'll just call, for the purposes of this conversation, pretext. Now, you talked in a way, perhaps without using this term, you talked in a way about theory of change for Palestine Action in response to this idea that maybe everyone starts to speak up in support of Palestine Action. And what would that do to the criminal system in the UK? In the most physical, tactical reality of, are they going to arrest everybody? What's that going to look like? Maybe they'll just give up. There's too much, the sort of I'm Spartacus effect, if you will. And yet there's something in the back of my mind that says, no, the UK government wouldn't even bother. They just pick up their favorite people, people that they may be watching already, that they now have an additional pretext to go after. I'm not saying this is going to be the reality, of course. I'm just thinking of people like Richard Medhurst, the journalist who was arrested under the Terrorism Act 2000. Asa Winstanley, who was also arrested. Asa Winstanley, the journalist from the Electronic Intifada. They had their devices seized. And even, I'm not going to pretend to understand the UK criminal justice system, but just the mere fact that they can have their devices seized upon arrest is in and of itself a major problem because there, as you might understand, especially for people who are journalists, there is very important, very sensitive information on those devices. And there's no excuse in my mind for saying, oh, well, they could be supporting a prescribed organization. Therefore, there's some presumption of guilt, which in my head is what the seizure of a device is an expression of, a certain presumption of guilt. I don't want to go too far afield here in this conversation, but I think I just want to express again my curiosity about how does this affect systems of direct action, systems of advocacy, systems of activism in the United Kingdom, and of course, not just in the UK, but in other places as well. You and I have talked extensively about the role of states in not keeping us safe and what that looks like and how that evolves over time. Um, and I've also talked in different forums, such as in my newsletter, about how there are certain ways in which official systems actually constrain the officials themselves. So there's a role, and I don't want to be simplistic here. I feel that there is a role for advocates to start to explore what are the other ways of expression that are enabled by something like this. What does it mean to seize and pick apart the different aspects of this moment? And that's not a way of saying, okay, well, Palestine Action will disappear and it will go away, and this type of this type of direct action will stop. Clearly, I don't expect that to happen. In fact, perhaps there might be a groundswell of direct action in defiance of this. Or perhaps there may be an evolution of direct action to be something else. Because clearly, well, I shouldn't say clearly, but I assume, certainly I believe that in arresting people like Richard Medhurst and arresting people like Asa Winstanley and prescribing Palestine Action, the government is trying to send a message, and it's using legal code, and I'll use this term again, pretext. It's using legal code as a pretext for doing this type of action. And then the government can say, listen, under this particular act, it's perfectly legal what we're doing. And again, I'm not going to try to pretend to understand the UK legal system. But it's clear because Richard Medhurst is back to broadcasting. Asa Winstanley is back to broadcasting. There are other people, pro-Palestine, anti-genocide folks who have also been arrested under the UK Terrorism Act 2000, who are back to doing their work. And I imagine that this work will continue, that there will be a whole set of people who will be defiant, will not be intimidated, and I think maybe for lack of a better word, I will use the word curious. I am curious what will be the social response to what is happening right now.
And I just want to point out, because I didn't, because not everyone is like familiar with the UK, it's a Labour government right now, like the equivalent of the Democrats in power. So we're not saying that it's Trump type person doing this. Yeah, there are people who because of what this Labor government is doing, will never vote Labor again. The Democrats, Labor, they support Israel. And to be having this conversation about people protesting the government when the real, obviously, the conversation is that what are those military um, installations, building, hoarding, enabling? It's genocide, and this is a wake up call for people who thought that um, this was, this is something that only happens under far right governments. But we saw that Biden was enabling, wasn't willing to say. In fact, it was Trump yesterday who publicly spoke, like said bad things and swore about Netanyahu in Israel, which other presidents haven't done. So I mean that's good, but it's falls far short when he's only speaking about it in terms of Iran. Like, stop being mean to Iran, but keep going with what you're doing to Palestinians. Um, is pretty disgusting. But this is, like you say, this is a way for people to wake up and see that, whose side is the state on, and it's not on our side.
Thank you. I definitely align with that. And I appreciate how in our podcast we come back to that message repeatedly, yet from different perspectives. And I often tell people that it's certainly my personal belief that there's not a right and wrong perspective through which to look at the world. Instead, I invite people to look at the world through different perspectives. That is to say, to try on, by their own choice, different perspectives and see what insights emerge when they do so. And so I would invite them as we close our recording today to do the same. What about the perspective that the state is not on our side? Forget about whether it's true or not. Just try on the perspective for a moment and see how the world looks. And when you see that the world looks a certain way, what thoughts come to your mind? What feelings come to your mind? And how do you see your own relationships with people and with institutions differently when you try on that perspective, even just for a moment?
Yeah, really good advice, a good exercise for us all to do to avoid binary thinking and other white supremacy culture patterns that we easily fall into because of the way that where we've been raised and how we've been raised in our cultures. But yeah, thanks, Chris. It's good to catch up with you. I didn't have anything to drink with me, but I will go get some mint tea, I think.
I was only drinking water, but maybe next time that'll be different. We'll have a proper team tool.
Very good. Sounds good. Take care.
You as well. Bye bye.
Bye.
You have been listening to Morning Tinto with Heather Luna and Chris Musay Sequeira. Each time we record, we use the news of the day to be as freshly brewed as possible. So subscribe, follow along, and comment if you can. Let us know what you think, and we will talk to you soon. Bye bye.